Thursday was the third day of the month of Tammuz. In 1994, that was the day that the media reported the passing of the Rebbe, which I take issue with. I don't view it as a passing. The Rebbe's presence is very much here and alive. But it is a day when we were denied the ability to hear and see the Rebbe. It's our handicap, not his. But nevertheless, this is a time for us to try to understand who the Rebbe was and is, as far as I'm concerned. Why do people have such high regard for him? Why do they, some people would say, idolize him? Which is, of course, not true. No human being is idolized in Judaism. But the Torah does tell us that when the Torah says that we're supposed to revere God, the Talmud tells us that that includes revering holy people, great Torah personalities, people whose lives are governed by the teachings of the Torah, who reach the pinnacle that a human being can reach in terms of serving God and being totally devoted to higher ideals. And if that's true about many great people, it's certainly true about the Rebbe, who, in my biased way of thinking, but there are also many unbiased people who become biased once they get to read about the Rebbe. The Rebbe is not just one of many greats, but, in my opinion, the greatest Jewish leader of this generation and of this century, and perhaps of many centuries before. I don't know anyone whose resume could match the Rebbe's, going back even to biblical times. And it doesn't mean I don't revere the biblical giants. I just feel that the Rebbe is in a league comparable to the greatest spiritual giants of the past. Last week we discussed some of the aspects of the Rebbe as a Torah teacher, probably the greatest Torah teacher of our time, who spawned who taught not only his own teachings, but brought the knowledge of Torah and teaching of Torah to millions of Jews worldwide, including this very class, and thousands of other classes like this that are thanks to the Rebbe's initiative. We spoke about the Rebbe's brilliance, someone who it's hard to fathom how much he knew and the depth in which he mastered all these subjects, every area within Torah knowledge, the mystical, the legal, the biblical, Talmudic. The Rebbe's command of all of this was legendary. The Rebbe has a memory that is unmatched. The Rebbe's brilliance in so many different areas, which I'm not going to go through again. But what tops it all was the Rebbe's love, his feelings of love for every Jew, and by extension for all of humanity, is unmatched, is unparalleled. The degree to which the Rebbe devoted his whole life to teaching, mentoring, guiding, and assisting others materially and spiritually. And while the Rebbe could have just remained in a position where he would be able to just be a teacher for himself and live his life and his favorite passion, which is study of Torah, the Rebbe devoted his whole life and gave his whole life for the Jewish people. So that we covered last week, but I want to continue and go through a few other items which we probably won't exhaust today. There's so much material. This is not for 2 classes. This is actually, I think I taught a course once with 6 classes, but 6 classes is also inadequate. It would be 60 classes we would scratch the surface. You know, sometimes people who are very great and very powerful and even good and loving people, but sometimes we lose our sensitivity to individuals. We take people for granted. The Rebbe's sensitivity was incredible. I start off with a story with my own son-in-law. When he was a little kid, I don't remember the exact age, but probably like 10 years old, he was at a Farbrengen, one of the Rebbe's gatherings where there were thousands of people there, and the people, the men, would be standing on bleachers, and the place was packed, and most of the people had their fixed places where they would stand. And my son-in-law was able to, stand in one of those places, and the people, the adults, pushed him out. What is the little kid doing over here? He's taking my place. And they pushed him out, and he tried to get a place in there, and they wouldn't let him. And he was very hurt by that they pushed him out. This is before the Rebbe walked into the room. The Rebbe walks into the room. I don't remember him telling me if this was immediately as soon as he came in there, or shortly afterwards. The Rebbe turned at a Farbrengen. By the way, the Rebbe would speak, but between talks, which each talk would last between 20 minutes and an hour, they would say l'chaim. People would take a little bit of wine and raise it to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would acknowledge and say l'chaim v'levracha, to life and to blessing. And this would go on every in between talks. Sometimes the Rebbe would point to some individual that they should say l'chaim. And this is what happened one Farbrengen. The Rebbe looks in the direction where my son-in-law was pushed out of the place that he took, and the Rebbe made a gesture like someone should say l'chaim. I think he made a gesture of a cup, or whatever it is. So all the adult men thought the Rebbe meant them. So one of them said no. The Rebbe said no, and finally the Rebbe's secretary, who realized what happened there, said, "It's the kid." And sure enough, the Rebbe was pointing to my son-in-law that he should say l'chaim. When they saw that, he had a very special place. They wouldn't push him out anymore. That became his permanent place. The story with my nephew's ingrown toenail is, I told this story so many times, but it's a very powerful story. My nephew was a student in the yeshiva in Morristown, New Jersey. My father was the Rosh Yeshiva. He was the head of the yeshiva, not the administrative head. He was the academic head of the yeshiva. And my father, when he would come there, he would take care of my nephew, his grandson's needs. Like he would take his laundry to my mother to do his laundry for him. And he was a very doting grandfather. And once my nephew complained of an ingrown toenail, so my father took him to a doctor, and the doctor said something that he misinterpreted. The doctor probably said, "I'm going to cut it out." He thought it meant, "I'm going to amputate the toe." So my nephew said, "No, I'm not going to let him do it unless I get a blessing from the Rebbe." A little kid, he was a teenager. He wasn't a little kid. He was about 15 years old. 14, 15, 16, I don't remember the exact age. And my father said, "I can't ask the Rebbe for a blessing from an ingrown toenail." The Rebbe would get hundreds of letters every day. At one point, I think he got 1,000 letters a day. Most of the letters where people were asking for blessings were about life and death situations, serious illnesses, really, really troubling events in their lives. And my father's going to call up the Rebbe's office and say to the secretary, "Could you please ask the Rebbe for a blessing for my grandson's toenail?" My father was just embarrassed. My nephew was adamant. No, I'm not going to let the doctor cut my toe until he gets a blessing from the Rebbe. So my father had no choice. So he calls up the Rebbe's office. The secretary, Rabbi Groner, blessed memory, answers the phone, and he says, "Oh, what can I do for you, Rabbi Greenberg?" My father was considered a very distinguished member of the Chabad community, and my father is like looking at my nephew, "Could you please save me the embarrassment?" And my nephew says, No, I want you to ask." He says, "Well, I want to ask for a blessing for my grandson." "Yes, and what for?" "For an ingrown toenail." And the silence on the line. Rabbi Groner was used to getting calls about someone is dying, they need a blessing. someone was in a terrible accident and the doctors don't give much hope. What should we do? And here, for an ingrown toenail, but his job was to take down messages, not to decide what is important, what is not important. And he said, okay, he gave him his name and his mother's name. That's how we ask for a blessing for health. And my father and Rabbi Groner both didn't expect that there'd be a response to this. But within an hour, I think it was, Rabbi Groner calls up and says, "You won't believe what just happened. I came into the Rebbe's room before the Rebbe arrived, and I put the letter, the note, which I wrote down, the ingrown toenail, on the bottom of the pile of his mail, because I realized he had more important things than the ingrown toenail." The Rebbe comes into his office, he sits down at the desk, and he starts going through the pile, as if he's searching for something, until he came to the bottom, and he took out the note for the ingrown toenail, and he gave a blessing that everything should be fine. The Rebbe not only acknowledged that, but he gave it precedence over all the other letters, because he saw that a child was in pain, was in anguish. The Rebbe didn't say, well, ingrown toenail, not a big deal. The Rebbe was sensitive to the child's need. That's one very powerful story. The Rebbe's sensitivity manifested itself in his speech. He never, I should never say never, but he rarely ever used any type of negative language. I'm not talking about not clean language, God forbid. I mean, that wouldn't even be something that could enter anyone's mind. But he didn't speak about death. He spoke about the absence of life. He didn't refer to evil. He spoke to the absence of goodness. Everything was in terms of the positive speech. You know, there's a lot of people who think we should use certain types of language and not use other types of language. The Rebbe was way ahead of his time. The Rebbe did not like the fact that in Israel, I think it's the only place in the world, and maybe Germany, where a hospital is called a house of the sick. Mm-hmm. In Israel, a hospital is called Beit Cholim, a house of the sick. The Rebbe says, how could you use a term like that? Someone comes into a hospital, and what are they told? I'm sick. Why don't you say that I'm going to be healed? And sadly, Israel didn't change yet. It should be called Beit Refuah, house of healing. And that's what a hospital is. A hospital it's a better word. I mean, America is ahead of Israel in that regard. The Rebbe did not want to use negative language. I don't know if the Rebbe meant this seriously or it was a joke. The Rebbe had a sense of humor, but someone once mentioned that he came from the Far East. So the Rebbe says, why call it the Far East? Call it the East that's not so near. In other words, learn that your language should express positive and not negative. And they manifest itself in many, many different ways. The Rebbe would open up all his mail. Even though he had a few secretaries, the Rebbe did not allow his secretaries to open his mail. So if he got 1,000 letters in a day, the Rebbe opened every letter himself. And when you open envelopes, sometimes first of all, it's time consuming, and the Rebbe's time was very precious. And secondly, you know what happens with paper? You get cuts. So one of my colleagues who was involved with different things, found that there's a machine, I think he got it from Israel, that opens up your envelopes for you. And he gave it to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe sent it back. And the Rebbe said, I can't use it, it's too noisy. So we got him another machine that was less noisy. And the Rebbe also returned it. And the Rebbe explained why he didn't want to use that machine. The Rebbe said, when some people send me letters, they seal their envelopes. Some people seal their envelopes with their tears. The Rebbe, I don't know if he meant literally or figuratively. How could I open an envelope that someone sealed with his tears with a machine? The Rebbe, when he opened the envelope, he wanted to feel the pain of the person who wrote to him. And even though he would have saved a lot of time and effort and pain, he wanted to open up every letter personally. Here's a story of a boy. He later on became the principal of a Chabad yeshiva, the secular principal. His father was a Holocaust survivor, and the kid was enrolled in the Chabad school, and he did very well in the secular studies, but he was absolutely a zero in the Jewish studies. He didn't pay attention, it didn't enter his mind, he had a mental block, and he knew nothing. His father was very naive, very simple man, so his father didn't know that his son really was a zero in terms of his Jewish studies. Now his bar mitzvah is coming, and the father, who was not a Chabad follower, but he revered the Rebbe, says to his son, I'm going to take you to the Rebbe for a special meeting in honor of your bar mitzvah. And this little boy was terrified. Why? Because it was customary that when you came to the Rebbe for your bar mitzvah, the Rebbe would test you. The Rebbe tested me when I came for my bar mitzvah. Luckily, he asked me 2 questions. One question, my teacher prepared me beforehand and gave me the answer, and it was just that question that the Rebbe asked me. The second question, I said, the Rebbe, I don't know, I didn't learn that. I was honest. And the Rebbe smiled, and the Rebbe says, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, also didn't have the answer. He was... So in other words, you're in good company. Don't worry. But anyhow, this kid was terrified because he knew nothing. Well, I should correct that. He knew one Mishnah, one paragraph of the Mishnah. Why? Because one of the punishments that teachers would give kids when they didn't behave, they had to study and memorize a Mishnah. And because he often misbehaved, he got that assignment, and there was one Mishnah, a very long one, that he had to master. That was the only thing he knew in his Jewish studies. And now his father is taking him to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe is going to ask him questions, and he's going to embarrass his father. And that pained him more than anything else, because his father had showered so much love on him as a Holocaust survivor. This is his only kid. And here he's going to devastate his father when the father discovers that his son is a dunce. So he wanted to get out of it. He made believe he was not well, and he overslept. And the day before, he had to go. He says, I can't go. And the father says, no, you're going with me. There's no way out. Finally, they come to the Rebbe's room, and the Rebbe is ready to ask him a question. The Rebbe asks him a question of that one Mishnah that he knew. And he answered brilliantly. The Rebbe asked him a few questions, and he got every question right. And his father was glowing with nachas, with pleasure. Look at my brilliant son. Then there's the story of my brother and the matzah. I told the story many times. Some of you may have heard it from me. Before Pesach, the day before in the afternoon, did I tell it last week? No, okay. It was Erev Pesach in the afternoon. They would bake special matzah, and the Rebbe would give a small piece of matzah to every person who would come by, and it would take a few hours, and you would get this little piece of matzah, and then you would, at the Seder, you would break it up in little pieces, smaller pieces, and give to all the people. It was more... You wouldn't fulfill the obligation of eating matzah with that, but you would have some of the Rebbe's specially baked matzah. My brother was about 14 years old, and this is the first time he was on the line to get the matzah, and he had to travel to my parents' house in New Jersey. So the Rebbe gives him a piece of matzah, and my brother naively says, could I have a piece for my father? And the Rebbe gives him another piece. Can I have a piece for my mother, for my grandfather, for my brother, for my sister? And the Rebbe very patiently, even though there were hundreds of people, maybe thousands, waiting to get that piece of matzah, and the Rebbe is standing all this time, and the Rebbe just gives him, and when he comes home, my father got so upset at him. So how could you take the Rebbe's time to ask for every family member? No one does that. You get one piece and you break it up into smaller pieces. So my brother felt terrible. Next year, he resolves, I'm going to get my piece of matzah and run. So he gets his piece of matzah, and the Rebbe turns to him and smiles and says, what about one for your father and for your mother and for your grandfather, for your brother and your sister? And of course, that made my brother's day. This happened a few times, that prisoners, mostly in the low security, the minimum security prisons, were given furlough, and they would be allowed to come to a yeshiva to learn Torah. They came to the Rebbe for a Farbrengen. So the Rebbe gave instructions before the Farbrengen that they shouldn't have them all sit together. Usually when groups would come, the groups would sit together as a group. He said they shouldn't sit together as a group. They should disperse them amongst the crowd. And the Rebbe explained, because if they're sitting as a group, people are going to ask, oh, who is that group? And what are the people going to answer? Oh, those are prisoners. Everyone's going to look at them. Oh, you're the criminals. And the Rebbe didn't want them to feel uncomfortable, so they're dispersed among the crowd. No one would ask any questions. They're just part of the crowd. They're not a separate group. And here's a real powerful one. The month of Tishrei, the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Pastora, thousands of guests would come from all over the world. At the end of the month, all the guests had an opportunity to have a meeting with the Rebbe, a very short meeting. And they would start in the early evening. I think it would start around 8 o'clock. And it went all the way till 10:30 a.m. So the Rebbe was meeting people, blessing them, and responding to their questions from 8 till 10:30, 14 and a half hours. But that was only half of the group. So the schedule was the next night, which would be, I think this was like a Tuesday night, the next one would be Wednesday night. The Rebbe would meet the other half. So the Rebbe's secretary, concerned with the Rebbe's health, the Rebbe was a man in his late 70s or 80s, said to the Rebbe, let's postpone the next meeting for Thursday night. That way you'll have one day of rest in between the meetings. And the Rebbe says, no, I can't do that. Why? Because many of the people were going back to Israel. If we have the meeting Thursday night, they couldn't get back in time for Shabbos. They would have to leave Sunday. They wouldn't be with their family on Shabbos. And Sunday is a work day in Israel, and they would miss a work day. I can't do that. For my comfort, I should inconvenience these people. So the Rebbe was up the next night. It lasted to 11:30. It lasted from 8 to 11:30. No break in between, nothing. Just straight meeting with people. Do you know any human being who can meet with people 16 hours straight? Someone in the late 70s or 80s? But the Rebbe's sensitivity to these people's, those people would have gladly given up whatever comfort they had for the Rebbe, to make life easier for the Rebbe. But the Rebbe did not want to, in any way, inconvenience people. Then there's the story. I saw this man many times. There was a man from Israel who came to Brooklyn. He was there for a few months. And he was terribly disfigured. I forgot what it was, a genetic thing, or it was an explosion. I heard different versions of it. What's not important, but his features were grotesque. He was blind. His face was all different colors. It was frightening to look at his face. Well, this is what happened. The Rebbe, in the weekdays, would pray in a small synagogue. And when the Rebbe would say his prayers, he would sit and he would hold his right hand like this on his forehead to concentrate. That's the Rebbe did every single day, every day of the year for decades. Then they noticed that the Rebbe wasn't doing that. One day the Rebbe did not put his hand like that. 2 days later, the Rebbe went back to that. A day later, he took his hand off. And this alternated for a few months. And then the Rebbe went back to going like that. So they tried to figure out, why was the Rebbe avoiding using his hands for support, which he always did? And they realized that this guy who had this terribly disfigured face was in the shul And the Rebbe felt that if he puts his hand like this, people are going to interpret it that he was so disgusted with that person's face that he couldn't even look at the face. So he had to block his vision. That's what people might say. And it might cause pain to this person, that he might think that he'll probably hear that the Rebbe, you caused the Rebbe to have to block his face. So the Rebbe, whenever that guy was there, the Rebbe put his hand down and did not follow his normal custom. Not every good person, loving person, sensitive person is a leader. The Rebbe's leadership is also an unparalleled leadership, because the Rebbe combined two contradictory aspects. World leaders are not known for their care for individuals, who focus on individuals, because they're running a country. A president is running a country, running a state, a city. People who are big shots, they're doing good work, they're good leaders. I'm not talking about the corrupt ones, but they don't have time for individuals. Their focus is on the community. Then there are people who are people's people, who love to deal with individuals, who are constantly volunteering and helping individuals. Rarely do you find someone who does both, and does both to the extreme. If you look at what the Rebbe himself established, when the Rebbe became Rebbe, the entire synagogue could fit into not half of this room, not a quarter of this room, but an eighth of this room. The whole synagogue, I could just figure it out, it's about 450 square feet was the whole synagogue. That was it. That was the extent of the headquarters of Chabad. The Rebbe's, main secretary, who was like the administrator of all Chabad institutions, had an office that was about 6 feet by 5 feet, 30 square feet. That was the extent. The CEO had an office of 30 square feet. We're talking about bare minimum. And then the Rebbe established close to 4,000 centers, all sorts of centers, this is being one of them. He led a movement from the ashes of Auschwitz and the Gulag, because that's where most of the Chabad followers were in Russia. They were in the Gulag. Anyone who was caught spreading Judaism, and they mostly were all doing that. And he turned it into the most vibrant Jewish movement in history. Never before has a Jewish leader sent thousands and thousands of rabbis and rebbitzins. As I mentioned last week, the Rebbe sent not single people, he sent couples, and they're both totally involved. And what's great about the Rebbe's leadership is the Rebbe is a leader who believes in the people he leads. The Rebbe did not look at a person and see the person's limits. He saw the person's limitless capabilities. There was I don't know if I'm going to tell the story right now. I'll tell the story. It's a very powerful story. There's an island in the Caribbean called Curacao. And there was this Jewish family. They were not a religious, observant family, but a Jewish family. And the son was sent to school, and the schools in Curacao, I think, were either Catholic or Protestant. So he went to the Protestant school, but they had mandatory classes of Christianity. It's a Protestant school. And the kid didn't want to be in those classes, and the kid started to skip classes, and he was told in no uncertain terms that he has to be in those classes. So the kid played hooky. His father would drop him off at the school. He would go to the park and play and come back at the end of the day when his father would pick him up. And his father didn't know that he wasn't in school for weeks. Finally, the principal calls the father in and tells the kid that if you don't come to classes, some harsh punishment will occur. You'll be guilty of truancy. So the father didn't know what to do. The father was beside himself. I forgot to mention that the father told the kid, if you're not going to school, you have to come to work with me. But that was illegal. The kid has to be in school, and that's when they were told that you better send the kid to school. So the father decided he's going to have to go ask God to help him. So there was a small synagogue. Curacao had a large synagogue, a historical one, and it had a small synagogue. And he lived near the small one. So he goes to the small synagogue, and before he went to the synagogue, he had a dream. His grandmother came to him in his dream and told him that there's one person who could help him. That's the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Rebbe could help him. He never heard of the Rebbe before, but this is a dream. So anyway, he goes to the synagogue, and he walks out of the synagogue, and a Chabad rabbi goes over to him and says, Shalom Aleichem. And the Chabad rabbi identifies himself, I was sent here by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. What happened? This rabbi, Rabbi Kotlarsky, got a call from the Rebbe secretary saying, the Rebbe wants you to go to Curacao. Without saying what for. Just go to Curacao. When he comes to Curacao, he gets off the plane and he goes into a taxi and he tells the taxi driver, take me to a synagogue. What else? I mean, if he's there, Curacao, he's probably, the Rebbe wants him to meet Jews. Now, usually the taxi would drive you to the large synagogue. Tourists would always go there. It was a museum. But he took him to the small synagogue, just as this man is coming out there praying to God that he should be helped. And sure enough, the kid was sent away to New York, and he became a Chabad follower, and he just married off a daughter or a son to another Chabad person this last week. They got engaged or they got married, I don't remember which one. Now, there's a letter that this man wrote to the Rebbe. The Rebbe, he described himself as a small Jew from Curacao. The Rebbe wrote back a letter and saying, there's no such thing as a small Jew. There's no such thing as a small Jew. That's how the Rebbe looked at everyone. I just reminded myself of another incident. It talks about the Rebbe's sensitivity and the way he valued every individual, including little children. In Jerusalem, there were two kids who started a loan fund, lending pencils to their classmates. Very cute little thing. Kids are, sometimes a kid comes to school, doesn't have a pencil, so they had a loan of pencils. And they wrote to the Rebbe asking for a blessing. They got a letter back addressed to the administration of the free loan fund. And the Rebbe is blessing them for their efforts. And the Rebbe said, I'd like to participate, and sends them a donation to help them in their work. Now, which CEO would take the time to write a letter to a few kids who were doing a thing of lending pencils to the Rebbe? That was not insignificant. The Rebbe didn't look at any little gesture as being insignificant. That's one of the paradoxes. At the same time, if you were the best, most successful rabbi and you built institutions, I have a colleague who built a huge, massive school in Paris. And when he came to the Rebbe and giving the Rebbe the keys to this massive school, the Rebbe says, when is the next building going to be built? The Rebbe was not satisfied. That's an incredible paradox. He treasured every little gesture, even a little child's gesture. A colleague of mine was writing a letter to the Rebbe, and his little kid who was scribbling, was like less than 3 years old, was scribbling a letter to the Rebbe. And he included that in his letter to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe gave a response to the child's scribbling. What's his name? Rabbi Sachs, Jonathan Sachs, blessed memory, the former chief rabbi of what?
From London?
From London, right. So he described the Rebbe's leadership, and he put it this way: he was searching for every Jew in love as Hitler hunted them in hate. And he cultivated leaders, not followers. He says a good leader cultivates followers. A great leader cultivates leaders. The Rebbe turned everyone into a leader. The Rebbe felt that every Jew is a leader. Everyone can lead. And the Rebbe believed in our own capabilities. It's interesting. This is another paradox. Hasidim of the Rebbe are so devoted. If the Rebbe would tell you to go on the roof and jump off, you would only ask which roof. But yet, the Rebbe developed within his followers a sense of independence as well. The Rebbe did not want people should just have to get this advice for every little thing. You're old enough to stand on your own 2 feet. And this famous story with Rabbi Weinrib, he used to be the head of the OU organization. He's a rabbi and a psychologist, and in his 30s he had a midlife crisis a little early, and he lived in Maryland, and he knew that the Rebbe was a very wise person. Even though he was not a chassid, he was not a follower of the Rebbe, he was familiar with the Rebbe's greatness. So he calls up the Rebbe's office to get make an appointment to meet with the Rebbe so he can discuss his problems that he was having. He was having doubts about his career. Should he be a rabbi? Should he be a psychologist? He was having some religious doubts. Whatever it was, he needed someone to discuss his problems with. So he calls the Rebbe's office, and the Rebbe's main secretary, Rabbi Chadakov, picks up the phone, and he doesn't identify himself. He says that I have to speak to the Rebbe. I'm from Maryland. I'm a Jew from Maryland, he said, without mentioning his name. Well, the Rebbe's secretary would get phone calls. If he felt that it was important, he would put the Rebbe on the line. And very often you can be able to hear the Rebbe's voice in the background. So he says to the Rabbi Chadakov, I want to speak to the Rebbe, and I'd like to make an appointment. And then the Rebbe in the background is saying, tell him that he should speak to Weinrib. That was his name, Weinrib. So the guy says, so Rabbi Chadakov repeats it. The Rebbe wants you to speak to Weinrib from Maryland. He says, I'm Weinrib. So the Rebbe says, well, then it's always a good thing to talk to yourself sometimes. And from that time onward, whenever he had a problem, he would take out one of the volumes of the Rebbe's teachings, study it, and then analyze his problem on his own and find solutions to it. The Rebbe wanted to empower people to be able to do things on their own. That's what a unique kind of a leader is. He's not looking for people to follow, he's looking for people to develop their full potential. And the Rebbe would bring Judaism, on one hand, aggressively. The Rebbe established the idea of mitzvah tanks, going into the streets of Manhattan and other places all over the world, asking people if they're Jewish to put on tefillin, but with love and non-judgmental attitudes. So you had, who would come to the Rebbe? Government leaders, generals, scholars, educators, business people, and most of the people were simple, average people. And everyone felt that the Rebbe was spending time with them, and there's no one else in the world. So even though the Rebbe would be up usually all night, people would come to see him, it could be 5 a.m, the Rebbe looked rested, he looked alert, and like, I have all the time in the world for you. People recognized that they couldn't take too much of the Rebbe's time, but the Rebbe was like so, never rushed. The Rebbe never felt rushed. You never saw him rushed. He was always utilizing every free moment. I have a nephew who used to be a rabbi in Israel, Chabad rabbi in Israel, and Chabad rabbis who work for the official Chabad organization would write reports every month about all their activities. So in one of his reports, he wrote to the Rebbe that his wife, who was in the beginning stages of her pregnancy, was having some complications. And the Rebbe gave his blessing. Months later, he gets a call from the Rebbe's secretary. I read your report, your most recent report, and it said nothing about your wife's condition. How is your wife doing? Now, the Rebbe would get hundreds of these reports every month. How many people have the time and the patience to read a report, a detailed report from hundreds of people? The Rebbe read every single one of them and noticed that there was no mention of his wife's condition. This goes back 50 plus years. When I was in Australia, there was a Jewish school in Perth, Australia. It's the most isolated Jewish community in the world. It's thousands of miles from Melbourne and thousands of miles from South Africa. And there was a Jewish school, and there was an Israeli who was a principal for many years. And then he decided, I spent my time away from my family, away from my home. I'm going to now go back to Israel. And he never reported this to the Rebbe or to anyone close to the Rebbe. And he gets a letter from the Rebbe begging him to stay there for the sake of the children in Perth. The Rebbe was in touch of what's going on in the world all over. In fact, the Mossad, the Israeli
Special Defense,
whatever they like, the KGB or the CIA, except Mossad is probably better. And the Mossad would come to the Rebbe and spend an entire night. The Rebbe debriefed them about everything they knew about Russia. And the guy from the Mossad reported that it seems that the Rebbe knew a lot more what was going on in Russia with Russian Jews than I did. He got every piece of information out of me. I got nothing out of him. The Rebbe was tight-lipped when it came to the situation in Russia. And the Mossad knew that if there's anyone who was able to do things in Russia with the Jews in Russia, it was the Rebbe. Here's a story with a state senator. I believe it was a state senator who came to the Rebbe, and after he had his own personal matters that he discussed with the Rebbe, and after he finished, he was ready to leave. The Rebbe said, "Can I ask you a favor?" He says, "You represent your district, the Chinese people." I guess his district included Chinatown. He says, "The Chinese don't have that many advocates for their needs. You know, all other minorities, the African American, the Hispanic, the Jewish, they all have advocates who advocate for them. The Chinese, at least at that time, did not have any real advocates, and they have needs. Could you take care of their needs?" Then there's a story with Shirley Chisholm. You ever heard of Shirley Chisholm? She was actually, I think, buried here in the Buffalo area. She lived here in Amherst. Shirley Chisholm was elected to the Congress, and the not so friendly, I could maybe call them racist, but not so friendly colleagues put her on the agricultural committee. Now, she's a congresswoman in Brooklyn. How much agriculture is there in Brooklyn? So she was really devastated by that. Like, she's elected to the Congress and she can't really do anything that's meaningful to her district. So she gets a call from the Rebbe's office that the Rebbe would like to speak to her. And the Rebbe tells her that, I understand you're very distraught, you're very upset because of what they gave you, but this is a great opportunity. And the Rebbe, I think, told her to make a connection to the senator of Kansas. What was his name? He ran for president. Bob Dole, who was in the Senate, and take advantage of the agriculture to provide poor people with food and their needs. And that's where the WIC program developed. And Shirley Chisholm herself said at one of her farewell parties that if it wasn't for this rabbi in Brooklyn, no one cared about the children who were hungry. This story was told by an aide to Senator Moynihan, who was there. Then there's the story of the Rebbe and Viktor Frankl. How many of you have heard of Viktor Frankl? Viktor Frankl was one of the greatest psychologists of our age. He was a disciple of Freud, but he veered off the beaten track of Freudian psychology. He believed that what motivates people is the pursuit of meaning in life. And he wrote a book that illustrates that point, that there were people in the Holocaust who had nothing else. They had no all of their desires that Freud claimed were part of our motivations. None of that existed. The only thing that kept them alive is that they felt they had meaning in life. The Rebbe was a very big fan of Viktor Frankl's approach to psychology. Viktor Frankl was being ostracized by his own colleagues. He was a professor in Vienna, and there was one point where he decided that he wants to give it all up, leave, and move to Australia. Well, the Rebbe, I told this part first, but really it starts off with a woman who was I think an opera singer from Austria, a Holocaust survivor who came to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe comforted her and gave her a lot of support. And the Rebbe told her, when you're going back to Vienna, come tell me about it, and I'm going to give you a message. And the Rebbe gave her a message for Viktor Frankl, that you shouldn't give up, you should continue in your ways, and you'll be very successful. And this is the miracle part of it. She didn't go to Vienna for a few months after the Rebbe gave her that mission. When she goes to Vienna, she finds out he's not in the university. He hasn't showed up for weeks. She comes to his house, knocks on the door, rings the bell, and a disheveled guy comes out, not very happy to meet strangers. And she says, I have a message from the Lubavitcher Rebbe that you shouldn't give up. Your theories are very good and very helpful, and you're going to succeed. And that brought him back to himself. And he became, even though he never became a chassid, he would send donations to Chabad, the Chabad rabbi, and he appreciated the Rebbe, got him back on his... Now, how did the Rebbe know that he was in that state of mind? And just as he was about to leave, a few days before he was going to leave, there was a messenger giving the Rebbe that message. There are so many thousands of stories how the Rebbe helped individuals. How he knew about these individuals is a miracle in and of itself. But my point is not the miracle part of it, it's the consideration, it's the sensitivity. And another thing about the Rebbe influence and strengthen other movements, even if they were competition with Chabad. I'll give you at least one illustration. There's a Chabad, the Rebbe started a magazine for children called Talks and Tales in 1941, I believe. Another Jewish organization called Torah and Masorah started a children's magazine called Olamenu a year or two later. And they were competition. Jewish organizations doing the same thing, they're competing. There was one point in the 1950s, I believe, in the 1950s or 60s, where the Olamenu was about to cease publication because of economic reasons. The Rebbe, when he found out about that, sent them a check of a few $1,000s to keep them going, and I think they're going to this day. Now, how many people know if people will support your competitor? But the Rebbe knew they're doing good work, they're educating children. I don't want them to go under. There was another case, I'll just share another case, where the Rebbe spoke to a person who was involved in Israeli Jewish education, and the Rebbe strongly criticized a Jewish organization called Chinuch Atzma'i. That's a Orthodox network of schools, and the Rebbe felt that they were doing a lot of things wrong. And the Rebbe told this person, I want you to try to get them to repair this, to make them stronger. This is a competition to Chabad institutions. And the Rebbe says, I don't want you to publicize my letter because it might hurt them in their fundraising. So don't publicize, just work on changing the things that they're doing wrong to make them a better organization. So the Rebbe goes out of his way to help his competitors. If we have to summarize what were the Rebbe's pioneering contributions, I would list the following. Other people might list other things and not these, or include these and add other things. The enhancement of women's involvement in Judaism. Throughout Jewish history, women were always in the background. Not because women were considered to be lower, but that was either because of economic reasons, because of social reasons. Women were never in the forefront of public Jewish activity. Women's role was in the home, and it still is her main role. Nothing ever changed in that regard. But the Rebbe put women in the forefront position, as I mentioned before. Every Chabad rabbi, and there are about 5,000, is a couple. They both work together. The rabbi can't say, I have my job, I'm getting paid my salary. My wife could just do whatever she wants. She could get herself another job on the side, or just stay at home and do nothing except for housework. I mean, that doesn't exist in Chabad. Every woman is equally responsible for the activities of the Chabad Center. The Rebbe also understood the power of children. The Rebbe didn't just love children. He had no biological children of his own, so you'd say, well, that's why he loved children so much, because he didn't have his own. No, the Rebbe saw the beauty in a child and loved it. I think I told the story once before, but once a kid was walking down the street and the Rebbe was walking, the kid didn't know that it was the Rebbe. He thought it was his father, so he comes over to the Rebbe and he wipes his face in the Rebbe's coat, and then the mother found out about it. She almost had a heart attack, and she wrote a letter to the Rebbe apologizing profusely for my kid's chutzpah and this. And the Rebbe wrote back, "Why are you apologizing? It was the most beautiful thing. If only adults could be so innocent, so pure." The Rebbe loved it. The Rebbe loved the child's innocence. The Rebbe saw the innocence. The Talmud actually refers to a child as Mashiach. Why is a child called Mashiach? Because the Mashiach represents the ultimate purity and innocence that you could imagine. That's what a child is. And the Rebbe saw that in children. That's why he loved to have children around him when he farbrained. And you had all these important people sitting in the dais behind the Rebbe, and who was on the floor playing with the Rebbe's shoes? The little children. And sometimes the child would fall asleep. And it was a beautiful sight to see. On Rosh Hashanah, when they would sound the shofar, the Rebbe wanted children to be on the platform because they have the greatest power. The Rebbe saw the 60s differently from all other Jewish leaders and secular leaders. Everyone saw the 60s as a bunch of young rebels and nuisance, and they were doing horrible things and counterculture and everything. The Rebbe saw the tremendous potential in the youth. And the Rebbe asked that we channel that power into something positive. Doesn't mean that what they did was all positive. It wasn't all positive, to put it mildly. But the energy, the youthful energy, was something that the Rebbe wanted we should cultivate. The Rebbe was also a great fan of senior citizens. The Rebbe denounced retirement and applauded the power of senior citizens. The Rebbe established kollels, schools for senior citizens, and asked that they be established all over the world. The Rebbe did not consider a person over a certain age to be useless, just to sit around and do nothing and look for ways to spend their time. The Rebbe wanted everyone to be. It doesn't mean you have to keep your old job, but you have to be active and never say that I'm ready to retire. I worked so hard my whole life. The Rebbe's pioneering expressed itself in the way he aggressively brought Judaism to people, to everyone. In the olden days, if you were religious, you separated from those who were not religious. If you were one kind of a chassid, you would keep away from another type of a chassid. There was such division in the Jewish community. Some of the division was natural, it was not malicious, but some of it, the Rebbe did not recognize division, and the Rebbe would bring Judaism aggressively, but non-judgmentally, to everyone. The Rebbe was very much in favor of technology. There were certain groups that said, no, technology is treif, it's not kosher, you can't use technology, because technology is used for so many negative things. That's true. But the Rebbe wanted us to harness technology for the good. The Rebbe emphasized the power of a single mitzvah. The Rebbe started mitzvah campaigns. If you go to other Orthodox communities, they will tell you that it's a good thing to try to bring Jews who are outside the fold into the fold and make them more observant and make them religious, Orthodox, whatever term you want to use. The Rebbe said, don't focus on getting them to change, and that's the only thing you focus on. There's nothing wrong with getting people to change, but every mitzvah that you do, even one time, has infinite value. It's God's commandment. It connects you to God. So the Rebbe started the Tefillin campaign, the Mezuzah campaign, the Lighting Shabbos Candles campaign, the Kosher campaign, a total of 10 campaigns, and the Rebbe added others as well. The power of every mitzvah, don't underestimate, just like you shouldn't underestimate the power of each individual, don't underestimate the power of each mitzvah. And the Rebbe also started a campaign to reach out to non-Jews to fulfill their 7 Noahide commandments. And many groups started all over the world where non-Jews have given up their belief in Christianity and have adopted the idea that God has a relationship with every human being, and while He gave the Jewish people a special mission, every human being has a purpose in this world and have these 7 categories of commandments that they have to follow. And the Rebbe treated, when people would come to the Rebbe on Sunday to get dollars, non-Jews also came. And there was one incident. I had someone that I knew. She's still alive. Her husband passed away. She was once driving, and she was stopped for speeding. This is in Brooklyn. And when she gives the officer her license, the officer noticed she had a picture of the Rebbe. So he asked her, "Oh, are you a follower of this rabbi?" And she said, "Yes." He says, "Well, let me tell you a story. The Rebbe, when he would go to the Ohel, to the resting place of his father-in-law, the Rebbe would go there at least twice a week and stand there for hours praying for all the people who asked him for blessings," which is another thing that is unparalleled. A man, that's how the Rebbe got his stroke when he was 90 years old, standing there. The Rebbe would stand, and the day that he went to the Ohel, that's what it's called, the Ohel literally means the tent, the mausoleum, the Rebbe would not eat that day. It was a fast day, and the Rebbe would come home late at night after standing for 5, 6, 7 hours straight. No break, nothing, no eating, just standing there and praying for thousands of people. And did this 2 days every week. In fact, the older he became, the more often he would go. And initially, when he was younger, he went twice a month. Then he started doing it twice a week. So the Rebbe had a police escort to, I don't know what the reason for the police escort. Maybe it was for security, because the Rebbe was on a target, a PLO list of targets for assassination. There were a whole bunch of prominent Jewish people, so maybe that's why they had the police escort. He says, "I was in that police escort, and I was told that this is a very great holy man, and he gives blessings, so I asked, would he give me a blessing? I'm not Jewish." He was Italian. So people told him, yes, the Rebbe doesn't discriminate. He gives everyone, whoever asks him, for a blessing. So he had no children. He was married for many years, and he had no children, so he asked the Rebbe, next time he escorted the Rebbe for a blessing for a child. And the Rebbe gave him the blessing. A year later, he had a child, and he named the child Mendel. So if you see an Italian guy with an Italian last name with Mendel as a first name, that's the blessing of the Rebbe to this policeman. I can go on. It's late. Maybe we'll continue this next week, or maybe some other time. Let me just read. I just mentioned about the Ohel. The next page. The servant of God through prayer. From the personal diary of Rav Sholem Ber Volpo. He was a classmate of mine. He's from Israel. He was a student in 770, and this is his diary. 1966. Yesterday, the Rebbe went to the Ohel and stood on his feet for 8 hours in the blazing sun. The Rebbe doesn't eat before going to the Ohel. When he came back, he was pale. It is a painful realization to think that as we sit in an air-conditioned room, the Rebbe stands in the sun for us. It is incomprehensible how the Rebbe does this. This past Thursday night, he had a gathering for thousands of people in honor of Yud Beis Tammuz, that's this Shabbos, for 6 hours until 3 a.m. That's Thursday. Before 4 a.m. he went home and then immediately returned to accept visitors in Yechidus. Yechidus is a private audience. The Yechidus continued throughout the day until 8 p.m., meaning 10 minutes before Shabbos came in. He then went home for a few minutes and returned for Mincha. He went home very late Friday night and for praying Shabbos afternoon for another 4.5 hours. That means he spoke for close to 4.5 hours. And now on Sunday he has spent 8 hours at the Ohel in the summer heat. Is that normal? I don't know any other human being who can do that. He did this regularly. This is not just one-time thing. He did this, and the day he got his stroke, he was standing there at the Ohel and praying for everyone. In fact, any time a person would ask for a blessing, no matter what it was, whatever the Rebbe answered, there was always the addition of, I will remember I will mention your name at the graveside of my father-in-law. That was always every request for a blessing, and that's a sign of the Rebbe's humility. The Rebbe didn't consider himself to be the Rebbe. He considered himself to be the extension of his father-in-law, that he was representing his father-in-law, and that his father-in-law was doing all the miracles and all the things that were going on. It was his father-in-law doing it. There's just no parallel to this, and I can't think of any parallel in Jewish history. How is a person who is able to accomplish so much with an amount of brain power and heart power, combining the two, is he dealing with a human being who is human? The Rebbe, suffered pain. The Rebbe sometimes would remark that he couldn't fall asleep at night. He didn't sleep more than 3 hours a night if he slept. But even then, sometimes he couldn't fall asleep because he was so pained by the suffering of others. And that's why the Rebbe, more than anything else, wanted Mashiach. That was the Rebbe's, if you ask me what was the engine behind everything, the engine behind the engine, it's his desire to bring Mashiach, to bring the world to a state of peace and goodness and holiness. And the Rebbe devoted his whole life to doing that, and continues to encourage us to do our part in bringing Mashiach. And how do we do that? Every time we do one mitzvah, that could be the one mitzvah that will turn the world around and tip the scales, as it were, and bring about redemption. And every time we have an opportunity to do one mitzvah or avoid doing something wrong, we should think about how the responsibility that we were given to be the final generation of exile and be the first generation of redemption. Are there any questions or comments? Yes?
In your opinion, the German Admiral
Canaris, yeah.
Yes,
he helped save the previous Rebbe, yes.
And he did everything what was in his power to help Rebbe to move from Europe to America.
Right.
He deserved to be in array of people who helped Jewish.
It's interesting. Canaris was a Nazi, but he was anti-Hitler.
He was anti-Hitler, yeah.
Right, and the question is, was he a real Nazi? But he did save the previous Rebbe. He went out of his way, and so I heard someone who lived in Grand Island, who his family was connected to Canaris. He passed away, so I couldn't get more information out of him, who claims that Canaris may have been a descendant of Marranos, of Jews, Spanish Jews who converted openly to Christianity and remained Jewish. So he had some Jewish blood in him, and maybe that's why he felt some type of feeling. It's a mystery to me, but he did get the previous Rebbe out of Warsaw that was being bombed constantly, and he brought him to Berlin, and from Berlin he went to
Denmark,
to Sweden, and from Sweden to Stockholm he came to America. Yeah, that's true. Although the process actually started with my father. When the previous Rebbe, when the war started in Warsaw, my father was there. And the previous Rebbe told my father, who was going to Riga, to speak to Mordechai Dubin. Mordechai Dubin was one of the most powerful, he was a chassid, but he was one of the most powerful politicians in Latvia. And he had a very good relationship with the Soviet Union. And that was instrumental in getting the previous Rebbe out of prison. But he told my father to speak to Mordechai Dubin and get the process to get him out of Latvia, out of Warsaw. So my father assumes that's all my father knew, that Mordechai Dubin got in touch with the American government, and the American government got in touch with Canaris, because otherwise how would Canaris know? But that's a separate story. It's an incredible story of how the previous Rebbe escaped.